That morning, the town square park was full of dogs wagging their tails, surrounded by laughter, children, the sounds of an ordinary Saturday. But at the far end, under the shadow of an old oak tree, there was one dog nobody went near. No wagging, no barking, just sitting alone, holding an old military glove in his mouth that nobody could explain. The handler said, "Nobody's asked his name all week." Then an old man stopped, a veteran, 68 years old, 5 years without talking to anyone, 5 years carrying a question with no answer. Why did they all die? Why not me? The dog walked forward, dropped the glove on the ground in front of him, and he saw it. The unit patch of his closest friend, the man who pushed him into a ditch, took the bullets meant for him, and never came home. This dog knew something. This is the story of Silas and Titan. If you believe no one should carry that weight alone, stay with us. This story is for you. And if it moves you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Cookeville, Tennessee. A cool autumn morning settled over the rolling hills just outside town. The sun had not fully climbed above the trees yet, and a thin layer of mist lingered over the empty fields. The world was waking up slowly, but one small house at the end of a gravel road seemed untouched by time. Silas Ketchum, a 68-year-old Iraq war veteran, opened his eyes at exactly 4:47 a.m. Not because of an alarm, not because he had somewhere to be. He simply could not sleep. He lay still for several seconds, staring at the ceiling above his bed. The room was dark except for a faint gray light creeping through the curtains. The silence felt familiar. It greeted him every morning before anything else did. Silas sat up slowly and rubbed a hand across his face. Another day. Another morning. Another reminder that he was still here. The floor creaked beneath his feet as he walked toward the kitchen. He filled the old coffee maker and waited while it hissed and rattled. The smell of coffee soon filled the room, but it did little to improve his mood. He carried the mug to the small dining table beside the window. The chair across from him remained empty. It had been empty for years. Outside, the gravel driveway stretched toward the road. Beyond it stood open fields and distant trees painted with autumn colors. The nearest neighbor lived nearly a mile away. Most days, Silas never saw another person. That was how he preferred it. At least that was what he told himself. 5 years earlier, after retiring, he had quietly withdrawn from the world. He canceled his phone service. He stopped attending community events. He ignored invitations from former military friends. Little by little, conversations disappeared from his life. At first, the isolation felt like relief. Then it became routine. Eventually, it became a prison. Silas sipped his coffee and stared through the window. The same question returned as it always did. Why am I still here? The words had haunted him for 10 years. 10 years since Fallujah. 10 years since the day everything changed. The memory arrived without warning, as it always did. Heat, dust, gunfire, shouting. Silas closed his eyes. He could still hear it, the crack of rifles, the roar of explosions, the panic that spread through the narrow streets. And above all else, one voice. Danny Reeves. Danny had been 32 years old, a Ranger squad leader, and Silas's closest friend during deployment. They had trained together, fought together, and survived situations neither man should have survived. Then came the ambush. Their convoy had entered a section of the city that looked abandoned. Seconds later, gunfire erupted from every direction. Chaos swallowed everything. Silas remembered diving for cover. He remembered trying to reach his radio. He remembered seeing Danny running toward him. And he remembered the moment that followed. Danny shoved him into a drainage ditch, hard. So hard that Silas lost his grip on his rifle. "Run, Silas!" Those had been Danny's last words. A burst of gunfire followed. Danny never got back up. Silas opened his eyes. His coffee had gone cold. The memory left behind the same feeling it always did. A weight pressing against his chest. A guilt that never loosened its grip. 10 years. And still he could not understand why Danny had died while he had survived. The rest of the morning passed like countless mornings before it. Silas cleaned the kitchen, checked the mailbox, walked around the property, returned inside. Hours slipped by without purpose. Around midday, a stronger breeze moved across the fields. The wind rattled the trees and sent dry leaves tumbling through the yard. Silas was sitting on the front porch when something white fluttered across the grass. A piece of paper. He watched it bounce against a fence post. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. Then he sighed and stood up. The paper had folded itself around a patch of weeds near the porch. Silas picked it up. A flyer, probably another advertisement. He almost crumpled it immediately. Then a photograph caught his attention. A German shepherd stared back at him from the center of the page. Below the picture were several words. Retired Canine Adoption Program, giving heroes a second home. Silas frowned. He read a little more. The event would take place the next morning at the town park. Several retired police and military dogs would be available for adoption. He was about to toss the flyer aside when one sentence stopped him. Those warriors need a home, just like you. Silas stared at the words. The wind rustled through the trees around him. For some reason, he read the sentence again. And then a third time. Those warriors need a home, just like you. The message should have felt simple. Instead, it unsettled him, because part of him recognized something in those words. Not the dogs, the loneliness. The feeling of being left behind after a mission ended. The feeling that the world had continued moving while you remained frozen in place. Silas folded the flyer and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He told himself it meant nothing, just a piece of paper, nothing more. That evening, he placed the flyer on the kitchen table. Several times he considered throwing it away. Several times he picked it back up. The house felt unusually quiet, even for him. As darkness settled outside, he found himself reading the details again, then again. When he finally went to bed, the flyer remained on the table beneath the kitchen light. Sleep came slowly, and when it came, it brought memories. Danny laughing during training, Danny sharing stories about home, Danny promising they would grab a beer together once deployment ended, promises that never had a chance to happen. Silas woke before dawn. The clock read 4:47 a.m. Again. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared into the darkness. The flyer waited on the kitchen table. For several minutes, he ignored it. Then he walked into the kitchen, made coffee, sat down, and looked at it once more. Something felt different, not dramatic, not life-changing, just different. The kind of feeling that appears before a person makes a decision they cannot fully explain. An hour later, Silas grabbed his truck keys. He locked the front door behind him. The morning air was cold. The engine started with a low rumble. Silas placed the flyer on the passenger seat. Then he began driving toward town. He still did not know why he was going. He was not looking for a dog. He was not looking for company. He certainly was not looking for answers. But for the first time in years, he was heading somewhere instead of hiding from everything. As Cookville slowly appeared ahead through the morning light, Silas tightened his hands around the steering wheel. He did not know it yet. But before the day ended, he would meet someone who would change the course of his life forever. Silas Ketchum almost turned the truck around. Twice, maybe 3 times. He sat in the parking lot with the engine running and stared through the windshield at the busy town park. Families moved between rows of tents. Children ran across the grass. Volunteers laughed with visitors, while dozens of dogs barked and wagged their tails. The entire place felt alive. Silas felt none of it. For 5 years, he had spent most of his days alone. Crowds had become unfamiliar. Conversations felt unnecessary. Even now, every instinct told him to drive home and return to the quiet house waiting at the end of the gravel road. Instead, he shut off the engine. A few moments later, he stepped out. The autumn air carried the smell of fresh coffee, cut grass, and fallen leaves. Music drifted softly from speakers near the center of the park. Everywhere he looked, people seemed happy. Silas moved through the crowd without speaking. A volunteer offered him a brochure. He politely declined. A golden retriever pulled excitedly toward him. He kept walking. Several retired police dogs sat beside handlers and volunteers. Some barked for attention. Others pressed against strangers, hoping for a scratch behind the ears. Silas passed them all. He wasn't looking for a dog. At least that was what he told himself. The farther he walked, the quieter the park became. Most visitors gathered near the center where the friendliest dogs waited. Few people bothered exploring the outer edge of the event. That was where he saw him. Beneath a massive oak tree near the fence line sat a German shepherd. The dog looked older than the others, not weak, not unhealthy, just tired. He sat completely still while the world moved around him. No barking, no tail wagging, no effort to attract attention. It was almost as if he had already decided nobody was coming for him. Silas stopped walking. For a long moment, neither moved. The German shepherd slowly lifted his head. Their eyes met. Something tightened inside Silas's chest, not because he recognized the dog, because he recognized the feeling, the distance, the exhaustion, the loneliness. The dog looked exactly like someone who had spent too much time carrying things he could not put down. A voice interrupted the silence. "Interesting dog, isn't he?" Silas turned. A woman stood nearby holding a clipboard. She appeared to be in her early 50s. Her name tag read, Martha Collins. Martha Collins was the coordinator of the retired K9 adoption program and had spent years helping former service dogs find homes after retirement. Silas nodded toward the shepherd. "What's his name?" Martha glanced at the dog and smiled faintly. "Titan." The shepherd remained motionless. He worked with military handlers overseas and later assisted training programs stateside. He's retired now. Silas studied him. "He doesn't seem interested in meeting anyone." Martha laughed softly. "Most people aren't interested in meeting him either." Silas looked around. She wasn't wrong. Families stopped at nearly every dog except this one. Children pointed at Labradors. Couples admired retrievers. Visitors filled out paperwork. Nobody approached Titan. For some reason, that bothered Silas more than he expected. Martha shifted her clipboard under her arm. "You know, you're the first person today who's asked his name." Silas looked back at the shepherd. The statement lingered in his mind. The first person. Not the strongest, not the friendliest, not the most impressive. Just the one everyone overlooked. Martha soon excused herself to help another family. Silas remained where he was. A breeze moved through the branches overhead. Dry leaves drifted across the grass. Titan still hadn't moved. The old shepherd held something in his mouth. Silas narrowed his eyes. A glove, old military leather, weathered by time. He took a cautious step closer. Titan watched him. No growl, no bark, no sign of fear, just watchfulness. Silas took another step, then another. The distance between them slowly disappeared. Around them, the sounds of the park faded into the background. The laughter, the conversations, the barking. None of it seemed important anymore. Only the dog, only the glove, only the strange feeling that had settled over him. Finally, Silas stopped a few feet away. "Hello, Titan." The shepherd's ears twitched slightly, the smallest reaction, yet it felt significant. Silas crouched. For several seconds, neither moved. The moment stretched. Then something unexpected happened. Titan stood. A volunteer nearby glanced over. Even she seemed surprised. The shepherd took one slow step forward, then another, straight toward Silas. The old veteran remained perfectly still. Titan stopped directly in front of him, close enough that Silas could see the gray hairs around the dog's muzzle, close enough to see years of experience behind those dark eyes. Neither looked away. The breeze rustled through the oak tree overhead. Then Titan lowered his head. The glove slipped from his mouth, landing gently on the grass between them. Silas stared. The gesture felt deliberate, not random, not accidental, almost like an introduction, like the dog had been waiting for someone, waiting for him. Slowly, Silas reached down. His fingers closed around the worn leather. The glove felt old. Military issue, used for years, kept for a reason. Silas turned it over in his hands. Then he noticed the patch. At first, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. His eyes focused on the faded stitching, the worn insignia, the familiar shape. His heartbeat slowed, then suddenly accelerated. No, it couldn't be. Silas looked again. The patch remained exactly where it was. Bravo 3/75 Ranger. The world seemed to stop. The park disappeared. The voices disappeared. The music disappeared. Only the patch remained. Bravo 3/75 Ranger. His unit, Danny's unit. 10 years vanished in an instant. Dust filled the air again. Gunfire echoed through narrow streets. A desperate voice cut through the chaos. "Run, Silas, run!" His hands began to tremble. The glove nearly slipped from his fingers. Across from him, Titan remained perfectly still, watching, waiting, as if he understood exactly what was happening. Silas stared at the patch, at the unit insignia he had not expected to see again for the rest of his life. And for the first time in 10 years, Danny Reeves no longer felt like a distant memory. He felt close, close enough to touch. For several seconds, Silas Ketchum could not move. The glove remained in his trembling hands. Bravo 3/75 Ranger. The faded patch seemed impossible. 10 years had passed since Fallujah. 10 years since Danny Reeves had died. 10 years since Silas had buried every memory beneath layers of silence. Yet somehow, one worn military glove had shattered everything. The sounds of the park slowly returned. Children laughing, dogs barking, people talking. But they felt distant now, like sounds coming from another world. Silas stared at the patch again, his vision blurred. Not because he doubted what he was seeing, because he remembered too much. The streets of Fallujah appeared inside his mind with terrifying clarity. The heat, the dust, the smell of smoke hanging in the air, the feeling of danger around every corner. He remembered moving with his squad through narrow streets lined with damaged buildings. He remembered Danny walking a few steps ahead, confident, focused, always watching out for everyone else. Danny Reeves had been 32 years old then, a Ranger squad leader, a husband, a father of a little girl who was only a few years old when he deployed. Most importantly, he had been Silas's best friend. The memory tightened around his chest. Silas could hear Danny laughing again, could hear him talking about home, could hear him promising that once the deployment ended, they would sit together on a fishing boat somewhere quiet and complain about getting old. A promise neither man had known would never happen. Then the memory shifted. The ambush. Gunfire exploded from every direction. Shouting, confusion, fear. Silas remembered losing sight of half the squad. He remembered trying to reach cover. Then Danny appeared, running toward him, not away from danger, toward it. The next moments had replayed in Silas's mind thousands of times over the years. Danny grabbing his vest, Danny shoving him towards safety. Danny shouting the words Silas could never forget. "Run, Silas!" Then the gunfire, then silence. The memory struck harder than ever before, because this time it wasn't happening in the darkness of his house. It wasn't happening during another sleepless night. It was happening in the middle of a crowded park, while he stood holding a piece of Danny's past. A sound escaped his throat, small at first, almost like a breath, then another. Before he realized what was happening, his knees gave way. Silas dropped to the grass beneath the oak tree. The glove remained clutched against his chest. His shoulders shook. 10 years. 10 long years. 10 years of pretending he was fine. 10 years of refusing invitations. 10 years of avoiding conversations. 10 years of carrying guilt that never became lighter. And now, all of it finally broke. The tears came without warning, without permission, without control. People nearby began to notice. A few stopped walking. Some looked concerned. Others simply turned away, sensing a private moment. Silas didn't care. For the first time since Danny died, he cried openly. Not quietly, not secretly, openly. The kind of crying that comes from carrying something for too long. The kind that cannot be stopped once it begins. Minutes passed. Eventually the storm inside him began to settle. His breathing slowed. The tears faded. The weight remained. But something had changed. Something had cracked. Silas wiped his eyes and looked up. Titan was still there. The old German shepherd had not moved, not once. He sat a few feet away, watching calmly, almost patiently, as though he had been waiting for this moment. Silas studied the dog. A strange thought entered his mind. Had Titan known Danny? The idea sounded impossible, yet the question refused to leave. How had the dog gotten the glove? Why had he carried it? Why had he given it to Silas? There were probably reasonable explanations. Maybe a former handler owned it. Maybe someone donated it. Maybe it was all coincidence. But deep inside, Silas couldn't believe that anymore. Not completely. The glove felt like more than an object. It felt like a message, a hand reaching through 10 years of darkness, a reminder that Danny had existed, that Danny mattered, that Silas was still connected to the world he had spent years trying to escape. Martha Collins appeared beside him a short time later. The adoption coordinator crouched carefully nearby. She didn't ask questions. She didn't rush him. She simply waited. Silas appreciated that. After a moment, Martha spoke softly. "Are you all right?" Silas looked down at the glove. "No." The answer surprised even him. For years he had answered every question the same way. "I'm fine, doing all right, can't complain." Today he couldn't say any of those things. Martha nodded gently, as if she understood. Her eyes shifted toward Titan. "He's never done that before." Silas frowned. "Done what?" "Approached someone." And the answer caught him off guard. Martha continued. "He usually keeps his distance. Most days he ignores everyone. Silas looked at Titan again. The old shepherd sat quietly beneath the oak tree, watching, waiting, the same way he had been all morning. A long silence followed. Then Martha smiled slightly. "I think he chose you." Silas almost laughed at the idea, almost, but he didn't, because part of him wondered if she was right. His gaze returned to Titan. The dog held it. Neither looked away. Something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. Two survivors, two veterans of different battles, both carrying things they could not explain. The decision came unexpectedly. One moment Silas was sitting beneath the oak tree. The next he knew exactly what he was going to do. He stood slowly. The glove remained in one hand. His other hand rested briefly against Titan's neck. The shepherd didn't pull away. Silas looked at Martha. "What paperwork do I need?" The question brought genuine surprise to her face. "For adoption?" Silas nodded. "Yes." Martha smiled. A warm smile this time, the kind she probably reserved for good endings. "I'll get everything ready." The paperwork took less than an hour, yet for Silas, it felt like something much larger. Not because he was adopting a dog, because he was saying yes to something for the first time in years. When everything was finished, Martha handed him Titan's file and wished them luck. The old German shepherd climbed quietly into the passenger seat of Silas's truck. Neither man nor dog seemed sure what happened next. The drive home passed in silence. Titan sat facing forward. Silas kept both hands on the steering wheel. Neither looked at the other. Neither spoke. Yet the silence felt different now. Not empty, not cold. Something else. The road stretched ahead through the Tennessee countryside. Fields rolled past. Trees drifted by outside the windows. For the first time in a very long while, Silas didn't feel completely alone. The feeling was small, fragile, easy to miss, but it was there. And as the truck carried them toward home, the loneliness he had lived with for so many years began to crack in ways he never thought possible. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes. Neither Silas Ketchum nor Titan made a sound. The old German shepherd sat quietly in the passenger seat, facing forward as fields and trees rolled past the windows. Every so often, Silas glanced toward him, almost expecting the dog to disappear like part of a dream. But Titan remained there, real, silent, present. When they finally reached the small house outside Cookville, Silas parked beside the porch and shut off the engine. For a moment, neither moved. Then Titan climbed down from the truck without being told. The shepherd paused beside the vehicle and calmly surveyed the property, not nervously, professionally, like a veteran arriving at a new assignment. Silas found himself watching. Something about the behavior felt familiar. Military men often did the same thing. They entered a place. They assessed it. They learned the exits. They noticed details. Old habits survived long after the war ended. Apparently, the same was true for retired K-9s. "Well," Silas said quietly, "I guess this is home." Titan looked at him, then slowly followed him toward the house. Inside, the silence returned, but it felt different now. For years, the house had been empty. Now, another heartbeat existed beneath the roof. Another living presence moved through the rooms. Titan explored carefully. He walked through the kitchen, the living room, the hallway. Each area received a brief inspection before he moved on. Silas filled a water bowl and placed it beside the kitchen wall. Then he opened a container of dog food he had purchased on the way home. Titan approached, sniffed, looked at the food, and walked away. Silas sighed. "Not hungry, huh?" The dog settled near the living room window, watching the yard, watching the road, watching everything. Silas recognized the behavior immediately. Titan wasn't relaxing, he was monitoring. The same way soldiers monitored unfamiliar territory. The same way Silas himself had done for years. That evening, Silas ate a simple dinner while Titan remained nearby. The dog eventually drank some water, but barely touched his food. Silas didn't force the issue. Neither of them seemed ready to trust their new situation. The sun disappeared behind the trees. Darkness settled across the countryside. Another quiet night arrived, except this time, Silas wasn't alone. Before bed, he checked on Titan one last time. The German shepherd remained awake, alert, watching. Silas nodded toward him. "Good night." Titan didn't react, at least not visibly. Silas smiled faintly at his own awkwardness. Talking to a dog felt strange. He had spent years avoiding conversations with people. Now he was trying to start one with a retired K9. When he finally entered his bedroom, exhaustion quickly pulled him towards sleep. Sometime during the night, he woke briefly, a habit left over from years in uniform. The house was completely dark, completely quiet. Then he noticed something, a shape lying outside his bedroom door. Titan. The shepherd was stretched across the hallway entrance, positioned between Silas and the rest of the house, standing watch. Silas stared for several seconds. The sight triggered an old memory. Soldiers taking turns guarding sleeping teammates, watching over each other through the night. Without realizing it, Silas felt something warm stir inside his chest. Not happiness, not yet. Something smaller, something gentler. Comfort. The next morning passed quietly, then another, and another. The first week felt awkward for both of them. Titan ate very little. He rarely approached Silas. He spent most of his time watching windows, doors, and open spaces. Silas wasn't much different. Years of isolation had left him uncertain around companionship. He often found himself sitting across the room from Titan with no idea what to say. Yet slowly, something began changing. One afternoon, while drinking coffee on the porch, Silas started talking. Not intentionally. The words simply appeared. "You would have liked Danny." Titan lifted his head. That was all. But it was enough. Silas continued. Danny never stopped talking. The shepherd remained still, listening. For some reason, that made it easier. The next day, Silas talked again. A few sentences became a few minutes. A few minutes became half an hour. Soon it became routine. Every afternoon, the old veteran sat somewhere in the house or on the porch while Titan listened nearby. And for the first time in 10 years, Silas spoke about things he had never shared with anyone. He spoke about Iraq, about long patrols through dusty streets, about young soldiers who never made it home, about fear, about regret, about guilt. Some stories were painful. Some were surprisingly ordinary. Stories about bad food, terrible weather, arguments over card games, small moments that had somehow survived in memory. Titan never interrupted, never looked away, never judged. The dog simply listened, day after day, week after week, and gradually the memories began to change. For years, every thought about Danny had led directly to guilt, the final moment, the sacrifice, the loss. Now other memories started returning, better ones. A memory of Danny teaching younger soldiers how to fish. A memory of Danny trying and failing to cook breakfast. A memory of Danny singing badly during a long convoy ride. The more Silas talked, the more those moments resurfaced. One chilly afternoon, the two of them sat together on the porch. The sky hung gray above the fields. The wind carried the scent of autumn leaves. Silas found himself telling another story. Danny once tried to convince an entire squad that he could fix a broken radio with duct tape. Titan watched him. Silas shook his head. He spent 2 hours working on it. The memory grew clearer. Danny was so confident. Silas paused. Then he remembered the ending. The radio had completely stopped working. The commanding officer had nearly lost his mind. The entire squad had spent days teasing Danny about it. Before he realized it, a sound escaped him. A laugh. A genuine laugh. Short. Unexpected. Real. The sound surprised him so much that he immediately stopped. The porch fell silent again. Silas stared into the distance. For several moments, he simply sat there, processing what had happened. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed while thinking about Danny. For years, every memory ended in pain. Now, one had ended differently. He slowly looked toward Titan. The old shepherd remained exactly where he had been, watching quietly, listening as always. Silas shook his head and smiled, a small smile. The kind that appears before a person even realizes it. For the first time in a decade, Danny's memory had brought warmth instead of guilt. And somehow, sitting beside a retired German shepherd beneath a gray Tennessee sky, that felt like the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. For a while, Silas Ketchum allowed himself to believe things were getting better. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to notice. The house no longer felt abandoned. The long afternoons no longer stretched endlessly from one wall to the next. There was still silence, but it carried a different weight now. Sometimes Silas would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee while Titan rested nearby. Neither needed to do much. The The simple presence of another living being had begun changing something inside him. Yet healing had never been a straight road. Some wounds waited quietly, then returned when a person least expected them. The nightmare came on a cold November night. The wind rattled the trees outside the house. Clouds covered the moon. The countryside sat beneath a blanket of darkness. Silas fell asleep shortly after midnight. For several hours, everything remained peaceful. Then the war returned. In the dream, he was back in Fallujah, back in the heat, back in the dust. Back in the narrow streets where every shadow could hide danger. Gunfire erupted without warning. The same gunfire, the same sounds, the same terror. Silas ran through the chaos as voices shouted around him. Buildings shook, smoke filled the air. Somewhere ahead, Danny Reeves was yelling orders. Silas could hear him, could almost see him. Then the ambush unfolded exactly as it always had. Danny appeared, running toward him, pushing him towards safety, sacrificing himself all over again. Only this time the dream refused to stop. Usually the memory ended with gunfire. Usually his mind spared him the rest. Not tonight. Tonight he heard everything, every shot, every scream, every terrible second. And when Danny disappeared into the smoke, Silas found himself screaming his friend's name. Danny! His own voice woke him. Silas sat upright in bed, breathing hard. His heart hammered against his ribs. Sweat covered his face despite the cold air. For several seconds, he didn't know where he was. The bedroom remained dark, silent, safe. But his body refused to believe it. The war still felt real. The guilt still felt real. The loss still felt real. Silas looked toward the clock beside the bed. 3:02 a.m. The same hour that had haunted him countless times before. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. Sleep was impossible now. The nightmare had left something behind. A heaviness, a darkness, a question he thought he had begun escaping. Slowly he walked through the house. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet. Titan remained asleep near the hallway. The old German shepherd lifted his head briefly as Silas passed, then lowered it again. Silas quietly opened the front door and stepped outside. The cold hit him immediately, sharp, unforgiving. The Tennessee countryside stretched before him, beneath a sky filled with clouds. No lights, no traffic, no voices, just darkness. Silas lowered himself onto the front steps. The wooden boards felt cold beneath him. For a long time, he simply sat there, looking into the night, listening to the wind, thinking. The memories returned one after another. Danny laughing during deployment, Danny talking about his daughter, Danny making plans for a future he never received. And beneath every memory waited the same question. Why not me? The words echoed through his mind. Why did Danny die? Why did I survive? 10 years later, he still had no answer. The pain felt different tonight, sharper, because for the first time in years, he had started allowing himself to care again. And caring made loss dangerous. The more he remembered Danny, the more he missed him. The more he healed, the more he realized what had been taken away. Silas leaned forward and buried his face in his hands. The loneliness returned. Not the ordinary loneliness of an empty house. Something deeper. The loneliness of being the last man left carrying memories no one else could fully understand. For a moment, survival itself felt unfair. Like a burden instead of a gift. The thought frightened him, because he had spent years fighting it, years convincing himself to keep moving forward. Yet here he was again, sitting alone in the dark, asking questions with no answers. The wind moved through the trees. Minutes passed, perhaps longer. Silas wasn't paying attention. Then he heard the front door open behind him, a soft sound. Nothing more. He didn't turn around, he already knew. A few seconds later, Titan stepped onto the porch. The old shepherd walked quietly across the boards. No barking, no whining, no dramatic display, just calm footsteps. The dog stopped beside him. Silas kept staring into the darkness. Neither spoke, neither moved. Then Titan slowly lowered himself onto the porch, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Silas released a long breath. Part of him expected the dog to demand attention, expected some grand gesture. Instead, Titan simply remained there, present, steady, patient. The same way he had listened to every story, the same way he had guarded the bedroom door, the same way he had sat beneath the oak tree carrying a glove from another life. Eventually, Titan shifted closer, very gently, very slowly. Then he rested his head on Silas's knee, Nothing more. No movement, no sound, just contact. Silas looked down. The old shepherd's eyes remained half-closed, calm, trusting. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, something inside him softened. The darkness didn't disappear. The grief didn't disappear. Danny was still gone. The past was still unchanged. Yet the crushing weight on his chest loosened slightly. Silas rested one hand on Titan's neck. The dog's fur felt warm despite the cold night air. And suddenly a realization came to him. Titan understood loss, not in words, not the way humans did, but somehow he understood. The shepherd had spent years serving beside handlers, soldiers, and trainers. He had been passed from one chapter of life to another. He had retired, been left behind, waited beneath that oak tree while families walked past him. Titan was a survivor too, not untouched, not unscarred, a survivor, just like him. The thought settled quietly inside Silas. Neither man nor dog needed to explain it. They simply sat together beneath the dark Tennessee sky. The wind continued moving through the trees. The night continued around them. Eventually, Silas stopped fighting the silence. For the first time that evening, he allowed himself to simply exist. No questions, no answers, no guilt, just the moment, just the company beside him. And somewhere between the darkness and the approaching dawn, the worst night he had experienced in years began to loosen its grip. Titan never moved. He stayed exactly where he was, his head resting on Silas's knee, his presence steady and unwavering. And on a night when the past threatened to pull Silas under once again, that quiet act was enough to keep him anchored. The morning after the nightmare felt different, not because the pain was gone, not because the questions had disappeared, but because something had shifted during those quiet hours on the porch. Silas Ketchum woke shortly after sunrise and found Titan lying near the kitchen window, watching the fields beyond the house. The old German shepherd lifted his head when Silas entered the room, then settled back down. For a few moments, neither moved. The silence between them felt familiar now, comfortable. Silas poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had spent countless mornings staring out the window, the same table where loneliness had become part of his routine. Today, however, something kept pulling his attention toward a small wooden drawer beside the refrigerator. Inside that drawer were things he rarely touched: old papers, military records, photographs, memories. For 10 years he had avoided opening it unless absolutely necessary. This morning, he stood up and pulled it open. The contents remained exactly where he had left them. Near the bottom sat an old photograph. Danny Reeves stood beside him in military uniform. Both men were smiling. Both looked younger. Neither knew how much life would change in the years ahead. Silas picked up the photograph. For a long time, he simply looked at it. Then he made a decision he had postponed for 10 years. He walked to the hallway closet and removed a small box containing stationery and envelopes. Returning to the kitchen table, he sat down with a pen. The blank page waited before him. For several minutes, he didn't write a single word. He wasn't afraid of writing. He was afraid of reopening a door he had spent years trying to keep shut. Titan quietly moved across the room and settled beside the table, watching, waiting, the same way he always did. Finally, Silas lowered the pen to the paper. "Dear Reeves family." The first sentence took the longest. The second came easier, then another, and another. Soon the words began flowing. Silas told them about Titan, about the retired German shepherd sitting beside him, about the old glove carrying the Bravo 3/75 Ranger patch, about the adoption event, about the moment he saw the insignia. Most importantly, he told them something he had never been able to say before. He missed Danny every day. The admission felt simple, yet it carried 10 years of weight. The letter grew longer. Silas described the strange feeling that had followed him since meeting Titan, a feeling he couldn't fully explain, almost as though Danny had reached across time one last time, not to save his life from gunfire, but to save it from loneliness. When the letter was finished, Silas read it twice, then folded the pages carefully. For the first time in many years, his hands were steady. Later that afternoon, he drove into town and mailed the envelope. As it disappeared through the slot, a small part of him wanted to retrieve it, to take it back, to return to silence. Instead, he walked away. The letter was gone. The truth was finally out in the world. All he could do now was wait. The days turned into weeks. Autumn slowly gave way to early winter. The trees lost their leaves. The air grew colder. Life settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with coffee. Afternoons often ended with stories shared on the porch. Titan continued listening. Silas continued talking. Some days he wondered whether the letter had ever arrived. Other days he convinced himself there would never be a response. Perhaps that was for the best. After all, what could they possibly say? Then one afternoon, everything changed. The mail truck stopped us at the end of the driveway. Nothing unusual about that. But among the usual advertisements and utility notices sat a single envelope. Silas recognized the return address immediately. His heartbeat quickened. The envelope remained unopened in his hands as he walked back toward the house. Titan followed closely behind. Inside, Silas sat at the kitchen table. For several moments, he simply stared at the envelope. 10 years of silence rested between his fingers. Finally, he opened it. A letter unfolded inside. The handwriting belonged to someone he had never met. Emily Reeves, Danny's daughter. The little girl Danny used to talk about during deployment. The little girl who was now a grown woman. Silas began reading. The first lines blurred almost immediately. Not because he couldn't see them, because emotion tightened his throat. Emily wrote that her father had spoken about Silas often, far more often than Silas ever realized. She wrote about family dinners where Danny shared stories from deployment, stories about courage, stories about friendship, stories about a man named Silas who could always be trusted, a man Danny considered a brother. Silas swallowed hard and continued reading. Then he reached the sentence that stopped him completely. "We never blamed you." He read it again and again. "We never blamed you." Emily explained that her family had never viewed Silas as the reason Danny was gone. Danny had made his choice. He had protected someone he loved, and he would have made the same choice again. Tears filled Silas's eyes, not the violent tears that came beneath the oak tree, not the grief-filled tears from his nightmare. These were different, quieter, gentler, the kind that arrive when a burden finally begins to loosen. Emily's letter continued. She thanked him for writing, thanked him for remembering her father, thanked him for giving Titan a home, and finally, she thanked him for surviving. Because if he had not survived, nobody would still be telling Danny's story. Silas lowered the letter. The room remained silent. For a long moment, he simply sat there, breathing, thinking, feeling. Then he looked toward Titan. The shepherd rested nearby, watching him calmly, the same calm presence that had carried him through the darkest night, the same presence that had led him to this moment. Later that evening, Silas carried the letter outside. The sun was sinking beyond the Tennessee hills. Golden light spread across the fields. Titan lay beside the porch steps. The air felt cool and peaceful. Silas read the letter one final time, then folded it carefully. Something inside him felt lighter, not healed completely, not finished. Some losses never disappear. But for the first time in 10 years, he no longer felt like the man left behind. Danny's story had not ended in Fallujah. Part of it had continued through him, through memory, through friendship, through survival. Silas reached down and rested a hand on Titan's neck. The old German shepherd looked up. For a moment, neither moved. Then Silas smiled, a real smile. "Danny sent you to find me, didn't he?" Titan stared at him. Then, slowly, his tail began to move. Once, twice, then again. The first genuine tail wag Silas had ever seen from him. A laugh escaped Silas before he could stop it. The evening wind moved gently through the trees. The fields stretched endlessly before them. And as darkness settled across Tennessee, two old survivors sat together on the porch. The future remained uncertain. The past remained painful. But neither felt quite so heavy anymore. For the first time in a very long while, peace felt possible. Silas Ketchum didn't go looking for healing. He just picked up a flyer that blew into his yard, just drove to the park because he couldn't explain why, just stopped at the far end because his feet stopped on their own. But sometimes, life arranges the things we don't have the courage to arrange for ourselves. An old dog nobody wanted, a glove nobody could explain, and two living things who had known loss, finding each other at the far end of a small park in Cookeville, Tennessee. This story doesn't say that time heals everything. It doesn't. Silas still wakes up at 4:47 in the morning. He still remembers Fallujah. He still carries the question with no answer. Why not me? Every single day. But he no longer carries it alone. And sometimes, that is all we need. Not an answer, not perfect forgiveness, just someone willing to sit beside us in the dark and not leave. If you are carrying something heavy right now, a loss, a guilt, a question without an answer, I want you to remember this. Titan didn't heal Silas with something miraculous. He just stayed. And sometimes, staying is the most miraculous thing in the world. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. Thank you for letting Silas and Titan walk into a small corner of your day. Stories like this exist because people like you are willing to listen. If this story touched you, even just a little, please like this video to support the channel. Share it with someone you think needs to hear this today. And subscribe so you never miss the stories that follow. Stories about people, about loss, about the small things that change everything. We'll see you in the next one.